Okay, our next presentation is entitled Risk to Availability and Efficacy of Pesticides by Scott Monfort. Scott's a peanut specialist at the University of Georgia, works on a lot of things. You've seen his presentations and titles of all his students, so he covers a lot of space, not only from an agronomy standpoint, but also from a pest management standpoint.
All right. Thanks for the invite to talk today again. Let's see. Went one too many here. There we go. To give this talk about the risks to availability and efficacy of pesticides. Man, following's right. I don't know if I want to do this. It's hard. 10 years ago, talking about pesticides is one of the things we really strive for, because again, productivity 10 years ago or 20 years ago, where we were only making 2,000 pound yields, and then we get good genetics, and then we get diseases and everything else along that, we had to utilize pesticides, and we still depend on them today. And that's the thing about it. We would love to get away from them, but we can at this point, not in the near future. We are striving very hard to reduce the dependence, but we are tagged with the responsibility in agriculture in feeding the world. And they say that we're going to, have more and more responsibility of this as we go forward with the increasing population. And part of that in the near future is going to be with pesticides. We cannot just walk away from them. It's not a switch we can just turn off. We wish we could. But the one thing that we can do is be good stewards and have the research and the recommendations behind them so that we minimize the effects on the consumer and what they eat. And that's what we're striving for. But I tell you, it's not a very easy solution. It's a very complex solution. I'm hope with this presentation today is to just bring out some information to share with the group that might only work on one side of this, whether it's insects or weeds or pathology or in any other area, that this is very complex. And we've got some solutions in some places, but we don't in others. And we got a lot of challenges. So I just want to kind of go through that. This group, not very hard to explain why pesticides are important. Again, we deal with that. We've seen numerous presentations on the impact of these pests on our production of peanuts, but not just our crop, but other crops. And that's something that I can't say too much about. When you go, well, who cares? That's not something that we talk about here because we know why they're important. But you step outside of this door and you go to anybody and say pesticides are important, they say, well, who cares? We want them off the table. And that's something that we're trying to at least try to figure out how to educate. So today, I want to talk about some of the, kind of go back in history and talk about where we began, but also where we're at today when it comes to efficacy of all the products that we use, but also dive into the availability. And that kind of touches a lot of different things, whether we're talking about COVID-19 or, reluctance of new products coming out, why that may be, but the government policy and the international policies, how they're affecting our availability of these pesticides. So that's kind of where I'm going to present today. And again, I'm an agronomist, so don't take that wrong. I'm just giving a bird's eye view of some of these challenges to hopefully just get some discussion points.
You are a trained pathologist, though, right?
I know, but Bob would not want me to say that. So, take it as is. So I take the first table here, and I know this is a little busy, but this is from some work that Jordan et al. Did looking at the risk to sustainability of pest management tools. There's a lot of things going on, but I want to concentrate on the thing that's in red, circled in red. That is the method of pest suppression on a 1 to 3 scale, 1 being most effective, 3 being least effective. And the 3 things that we use to control pests is what? Cultural practices, cultivar resistance, and pesticides. And if you look with all the letters, that is cultural because there's so many different cultural practices, but they are mainly 2s and 3s. And if you go to cultivar resistance, again, those are 2s and 3s. We've made some great leaps with resistant in the last few years, but it's only to certain things. It's not everything. And so you have to step over and look at the chemical control on the far right and look at that. We are heavily dependent on including them in our everyday management of pests. And so that is why that we have to continue to talk about pesticides. Boy, that really went crazy. I'll get it back. Hold on. It really went crazy. It does not like me. There we go. I don't know if it's sharing them.
I don't think it's sharing. Let me do it.
Taking all the pressure off me for tomorrow. Hey, I'm trying. See, this is what you get for putting our agronomists in this role. But I'm trying to take pressure off all the rest of you guys.
I'm an agronomist too.
So we're working on it.
Okay. That's screen share. Hope it works in one time. Probably not. Let me do it again. No, they made me do it twice for some reason.
Huh.
I don't know why. Sure.
But like I said earlier, we at this point are very, very dependent on at least some part of our management dealing with pesticides today. And we are facing quite a few challenges from pesticides currently and in the near future as we go forward. But you do have to ask, when we look at the dependence on that, when we look at the risk to the efficacy, and that's where I'm going to start, it is resistance. That's what we talk about across the board, is trying to minimize that impact of resistance, because pesticides do lose efficacy. There's a lot of reasons why, and we've seen resistance build up in all three of these areas: insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. But I got to applaud everybody in this room. We work every day a lot trying to use IPM strategies to reduce the spread or the increase of resistance, and try to slow it down as much as possible through cultural practices, like I said, different modes of action, timing of applications. That sounds simple, right? Well, there's a difference between a 2-inch weed and a farmer's 2-inch weed. Scouting, that's probably the biggest thing with some things like insecticides, and making sure we're applying the right chemicals for the right insects or what it might be. Also, sounds simplistic, but using the correct pesticides and following the label. My goodness, that's one that we're having problems with, whether we're not able to read them or not, I'm not sure, but we're having some problems. And we got to minimize that. But I'm going to start with fungicides, and I just want to point out a couple of things. One, this is I borrowed this from Dr. Brenneman and Colbert. This is rise and fall of peanut fungicides over time from the 1970s till today. We got 5 different classes basically that we're working with. And if you see, most of those come before the 1980s. We've added 2 classes, the strobilurins and SCHI, since then, but not another class has been developed since that time. And we have put more and more and more pressure on these pesticides to control these diseases. That's one of the reasons we've gone again from a ton per acre to more than 2 tons per acre, because we can control diseases. Now, we have done one good thing with the last couple of years is these premixes. At least that's pulling different modes of action together. So that's allowed us to slow that as well and try to use these things in programs where we're altering our different fungicides. So that also helps. So, but that does not tell the whole story, because sometimes we can slip up. Back in 1970s, when Benamil and chlorothalonil were released, one was a single site fungicide mode of action, one's multi-site. The single site worked great for a couple of years, but resistance built up because we used it too much or used it a lot. And then we come out with chlorothalonil, and we're still using that. It is one of the most important fungicides that we still use today. Another example is tebuconazole. That's something that came out in 1994 and basically changed the game. Our yields went up, control of diseases, both soil-borne and foliar, turned around. This is just a to show you in 1994 on the left, that's what good control we were getting. But by 2005, with the repeated use in a lot of these programs, we've lost the efficacy in leaf spot. And so that's one thing that we're dealing with now. We still use tebuconazole for a soil-borne fungicide, but with it being cheap, guess what? We're using an awful lot of it. So that does not help us as well. To kind of give you some data from Stevenson and Colbert showing the sensitivity shift down on the bottom, 1996, you see how much it took for EC50 of the product to get to an EC50, but in 2006 it did shift over, and it's quite a bit more insensitive to that product. So we're having to watch these. It's not the only products out there we're seeing this. Just to give another example of something that just had recently happened was seed treatments. And Dynasty PD was on every seed in our marketplace, and azoxystrobin was part of that. Well, 2 years ago, aspergillus really started to overcome azoxystrobin or some of the chemistries in Dynasty PD, and we had to do a complete shift to a whole new chemistry, and that saved us, at least for the time being, 2 aspergillus species. So at least we had the products to make that shift and save the industry a little bit. But again, we are seeing some of these by continual use. Now, this is obviously not peanut, it's soybeans. And I put this up there, Travis Foskey gave it to me, because one thing, we use these fungicides in different crops, rotating crops. Soybeans, we don't like to rotate with peanut, but the reason I also put this up there is 6 ounces is normal rate. Growers figured out that, hey, a reduced rate, I can get a yield bump without the disease being there. And so they started reducing rate, using it a lot, and guess what? We got resistance to this particular one, to frog eye leaf spot. And that's something that, hey, that's another thing that's going to take that chemistry away from us eventually. So things to work out. So here we are with, again, the 5 classes, and we got 3 classes there that are pretty risky as far as resistance buildup. We've got a lot of chemistries in there. I'm not saying all the chemistries have resistance built to them, but again, we have some that we're worried about. The one up top, Benamil, got taken off the marketplace, but there is still thiophanate methyl in there, and we know it can have resistance build up pretty quick. So there are some things here that, and what worries you is that we're not having any different classes come out. So that's the other thing I want to point out there. Insecticides are not that much different. We do have problems here. We like that. We've had some of these insecticides since the 1930s. Most of them come out in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And we've had some come out in the 2000s, but again, not that many. And that's something that that bothers us a little bit. You would hope that we would have plenty of options. We don't. And so we do have some situations here as well. We've developed resistance to pyrethroids, to soybean looper, and tobacco budworm, which are important foliage feeders in peanut. We've also had some resistance to neonics, to thrips, and pyrethroids to velvet bean. For some reason, those 2 insects, some years they seem to be susceptible and some years they don't. So talking with Mark Abney, I don't really understand that, but we do or have seen that to be a problem in some years. Now, that is pyrethroids. What is one thing that our growers do constantly with pyrethroids and why we're in this situation? We're going across the field 7 times with fungicides. I want to just throw pyrethroids in there to clean up. That's the problem, whether we got insects or not. So that's one of the reasons that caused this situation, not the only one, but one of them. So here we got 2 of these classes that are going out here. But the nice thing about it is, in insecticides, we've got some other products that help us with foliage feeders, help us with thrips. The bad thing about the thrips problem, you know, imidacloprid helps us, but they got resistance there, is we use 4-8. Well, carbamates and organophosphates are pretty much on the chopping block for EPA. So that's the other thing. If they turn around and take those away from us in the near future, which they did with chlorpyrifos pretty quick, they took the food tolerances away from us, and that didn't allow us to use the inventory that we had. We did not have an alternative in some of our insects that chlorpyrifos gave us, or at least for control. So we are worried that, you know, we could lose some of these due to EPA as well. All right, so herbicides, not much different from what I've already presented. A lot of our chemistries come early. 1980s to the 1990s, cooled off in the 2000s. Very few herbicides in the pipeline. We got a few, but very few. And if you look at the weed spectrums, or if you look at some of these classes of herbicides, we use them in other crops as well, fighting the same exact weed pressure in some of these other ones. So it puts a lot of pressure on these herbicides. And if you look at this, we've got several different weed species with multiple resistance to a lot of these herbicides. The biggest one being what? Pigweed. That's the one weed that we need to figure out how to make that a crop. So gotta figure out how to make it a crop where it'll disappear. But nevertheless, we are in trouble. And again, it's not just these weeds that we deal with, it's other crops. We use rotational crops to mix chemistry so that we can reduce things. These are some pictures from North Carolina. All kinds of resistance building up in these different rotational crops to different chemistries that we used to use. So we are using all the tactics in the box that we can. This is one that most people don't want to see or deal with, but Georgia, we're pulling a lot of weeds, trying to get those escapes out of there to help with resistance management. So we are doing the best job that we can. And so when you look at this chart again, that's over half of our classes of herbicides that have developed resistance. We have pulled a few off, Alicor and Dynaseb, for toxicology reasons. Those come off, so we lost some of that, but we're getting close to the point where just resistance is putting a lot of pressure on what we got for management options. And I have not heard of a lot of resistant plant options that would help us with weeds yet, and that's the one that hurts us the most. We don't have good plant resistance for herbicides or any other thing. The other part of this whole resistance management, we can do everything we can educational-wise, resistance-wise. This whole grower thing has thrown another monkey wrench into it, if you want to call it that. They are cutting corners. They're using the same pesticides over and over and over. They're not scouting correctly. They're basically using some of this when we don't even have pests or pest problem. Being timely, minimum spray volume, fast application speeds. We got sprayers running 12 to 15 miles an hour in the field now. And so whether we're getting good coverage or not, using the wrong recommendations. Man, you think that would be an easy one, but that's not. Lack of education. We got more and more growers that are not coming to meetings. They're dependent on the dealers and their consultants to give that. And we got some great consultants, but we still have a lack of education for some of the problems that we're dealing with for these growers. All right. That kind of hurts us a little bit with industry standing here saying, well, if we can't handle the resistance to some of these new, we don't get 20 years of a use out of a product, can we really develop one and bring one to market that is risky? And so that may be the one reason that we're slowing down in that, but it's also that EPA investment or EPA situation that is causing some problems. So they're not the only ones that seeing problems. So I'm going to move away from efficacy and start talking about availability. And in the short term, we can talk about availability, and we've talked about shortages over the last 2 years because of the epidemic. Global slowdown of manufacturing. You could say that about almost anything that we've got up here we've had problems with, but that is not, in my mind, our problem. When it comes to it, it's the general public. Our consumers have now got this idea that everything that we put on a peanut, whether it's pesticides or something that looks bad, it is bad. And so we've got to figure out a way to better educate. And they're putting a lot of pressure on EPA. And EPA has responded. And EPA has responded in a situation that's not usual, or it's non-typical. This whole Endangered Species Act has been available or been enacted since 1973. And that's what they're pushing to shut down some of the use of some of these pesticides. And you go, why now? Well, it's because they are getting pressure, and this is kind of a backdoor tactic to minimize the use of some of these pesticides. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to give you some examples here, but they did this on January the 11th of this year. And so this implicates not peanut at this point, but it puts implication on cotton, on some of the herbicides being used in cotton. But you can easily see where this could quickly go to any pesticide we use for endangered species. Because when you look at Georgia, 151 out of 159 counties have some type of endangered species. Some type. Now, whether or not they're close to a field or not, that's a whole different story. And what the EPA has two ways to make this happen. They can go through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and try to get a decision on what to do, but what they've done is kind of went around that and said, no, we're going to go directly and do it ourselves. And basically what we're doing is anything that's being renewed or registered, they're going to have to meet these things with the Endangered Species Act. And what does this mean? What does this do? Well, to give you an idea, dicamba, and everybody knows dicamba. It is something that's been going on. They put this out in these live bulletins that hey, we're doing this right now. And there is 9 counties in the state of Georgia that they're close to this one salamander, if I'm not mistaken. Eric, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Or some endangered species. It's in a small part of one county. Guess what? They said, well, since it's in these, we're going to basically use county lines, and you can't use these products. And so if you just take those 9, what it is they're going in these fields, and if it's a big field, you got they're requiring buffers in the field before you get to the woodland area or to the habitat. And so based on the wind, that's telling you which way the buffers go. But in a big field, that might be 31%. But in the small fields in Georgia, that's close to 50%, or could be 50%. If you put this into perspective, those 9 counties, cotton in the state's 1.2 million acres. Those 9 counties is 22,000 acres. Those herbicide buffers are 89,000 acres that did not get treated or will not get treated. The other one is Enlist Duo, that is 2,4-D and glyphosate. They basically come out and said in these counties in black, you will not be able to use these at all in those counties. So, and again, that's because of endangered species. But this could easily go to any insecticide. It could go to any herbicide or any fungicide. So it is something that we really need to keep track of. Now, the other thing that, again, makes this more complicated, it's not just what we got to do in the U.S., but now we got to figure out what the EU wants, because we do export stuff to the EU. This makes it very complicated because they want to get rid of all pesticides. And they have, to some degree, for all their growers. All this stuff in red and some in black, and for all uses, they've gotten rid of the ones up top, and some of the ones in the bottom, they've gotten rid of all the field uses. And so if you look at those, some of those in red are some of the ones that we use. And I would say the very first one in red, propiconazole. That didn't come from EPA that we couldn't use it anymore. What happened? That come from the EU, said that they won't buy our peanuts if it's on it. So now we have the shelter say, you can't put that out as a fungicide in order for us to buy. So does that happen for the rest of the stuff that we put out? Sure, if we're in this marketplace, it's gonna put a lot of pressure on that to happen. So we're getting hit from both sides here, as well as the public. They're doing it through residual levels. And what they've done is our equipment now can detect stuff at very small levels, and it's well below what our EPA says is safe. They can detect it now, and they are dropping some of these down to the default tolerance of 0.01 part per million. And that's almost, it could get a whiff from another field down the road, and you might get that. So it is hard to deal with this. They want to reduce all the pesticides by 50% by 2030. And they want to subject that to all of the people they buy peanuts from. So it is definitely something that we worry about. And guess what? What's at the top of that list? Chlorothalonil. That was mentioned a while ago. That's a dramatic change for us, or could be, if we didn't have that in our arsenal. We can get around it, but it's not a perfect one. Clethodim, which is a grass herbicide, fluropyram. Man, we use a lot of fluropyram for nematode control, or part of our nematode control program. Tetraconazole is another of the triazoles that they reduced down. And so I don't think that they're going to shy away from any of the triazoles. It's probably going to go at all of them eventually. So when you start looking at these charts again, we, the things in yellow are what we got resistance to or risks to. The ones in green are what the EU has already proposed changes. And then we got the boxes shaded in purple, and that's the ones that we're getting hit from all angles, both consumers, EPA, and EU, as well as our resistance management program. So we don't have many classes there that we can work from if we cannot get some new chemistry classes out. You look at the fate of insecticides, it's still there as well. So we've got a lot that have resistance, one that EU's taken out. You've got the EPA that already took out chlorpyrifos, but guess what? If it's their choice, they're going to get rid of the organophosphates and the carbamates, and guess what? Our thrips control just went out the window, or at least that with tomato spotted wilt. That's the one thing that we got to worry about. And then the indoxacarb was one that the EU also was looking at. You look at the herbicide situation, again, I think our biggest thing is resistance. That's the thing that we got to worry about with that. But even that, we've got some things that are being pushed on us. The paraquat, we got more restrictions on paraquat, which is important to us. And then I got in blue down there, the auxins. That's the dicambas, that's the, 2,4-DB or 2,4-D. 2,4-DB is really not in that mix yet, but it could be. And so we are getting hit there. And so we don't have anything left that might be, because we got a lot of things to try to control. So we are in a dire situation where our pipeline for pesticides is damaged. And don't get me wrong, I think we do need to move away from them, but we can't completely. We can't just turn it off. It's going to be when we say short term, it might be 30 years from now before we can get enough things to get away from pesticides. It's not just turn it off and y'all deal with it. We need more viable options. We need a better way to educate the public. I say we need an advertise agency to prove how good agriculture is, not just to defend what we don't need to lose. So that's something we got to work on. We need to educate growers to do their part. We put the information out there, but some reason they don't always go by it, and we got to work on that. And we got to find ways to stress the importance of science in these decisions. The EU is not using science, or at least not much of it. We've got to figure out ways to do it instead of what we call fake news. I know everybody loves to hear that again, but we got a lot of fake news out there when it comes to some of these things, not just pesticides, but others. So I would say feeding the world is not going to be very easy without the use of pesticides for at least the next 20 years. And so we need to do our parts to be better stewards and to really do the best job we can to make sure that we do everything as far as education to try to keep those around if possible. And I think all of us want to do better, but this is just not something that we can just turn off. And I've said that many times. I couldn't put all this together with everybody on this list. Again, this is overwhelming. This is just a kind of a glimpse. This thing is big. And if you've not worked in herbicides, you've worked somewhere else, you need to get used to looking at some of this. They've already done this to atrazine, glyphosate, a lot of these things, insecticides. So, I mean, we've got to really pay attention here. We can't, as a group, ignore it. And I know we're all working hard at protecting what we got, but we also got to work about getting more chemistries here. So with that, I'll take any questions that you have.
Got time for one question.
Two questions. Do you see any going to seeing some articles where they're going to and then there's some pesticides?
With no-till? I mean, no-till, that's what you're saying. Will pesticide usage go up in no-till?
Yes.
There are some situations where it possibly could. We don't, in a lot of our areas, don't use no-till because it does take away from our yield. And we've got to be able to make yield. And that's the biggest thing, trying to maintain our yield potential. Will it go up? Some people say, well, if you can get beyond a certain period, you might start to not be as dependent on the short term. But I tell you, weeds in a no-till situation would kill us. And so, yeah, I would think your dependence would go up for certain things. All right, thank you.